The Velari Dominion had conquered 412 star systems in less than a century. 7 alien species had bowed before their warships, signed their treaties, and handed over their worlds without much of a fight. The Dominion did not ask permission. It arrived, it demonstrated its strength, and it took what it wanted. That was the way of things in their part of the galaxy, and no one had ever given them a reason to think it would change. So when the Dominion turned its attention toward human space, there was no fear among its commanders. There was barely even curiosity. Humans were new to the galactic stage. They had only been traveling between stars for a little over 200 years. Their fleet was small by Dominion standards. Their territory was modest. Their reputation, among the species that bothered to keep track of such things, was that they were stubborn, noisy, and not particularly impressive. Grand Marshal Thyrak, Supreme Commander of the Dominion's 2nd Expeditionary Armada, had studied the intelligence reports on humanity and found them almost boring. Their ships were ugly. Their weapons were outdated by at least a generation compared to Dominion standards. Their tactics were blunt. The only thing that mildly interested him was their stubbornness. Several minor skirmishes along the border had shown that human captains did not retreat when they should. They fought past the point of reason. Thyrak considered this a flaw, not a strength. A species that did not know when to surrender was a species that would suffer more than it needed to. The target was the Helios Corridor. It was a narrow lane of stable hyperspace that connected Earth's core systems to 3 frontier colonies on the outer edge of human territory. Whoever controlled Helios controlled the gate. Without it, those colonies would be cut off, and Earth's fleet would be forced to take a longer route that added weeks to any deployment. It was, in simple terms, a choke point. And choke points won wars. Thyrak had planned the operation carefully. For months, Dominion raiding parties had harassed human border outposts in 4 different sectors, stretching Earth's United Fleet thin across multiple fronts. Pull the defenders apart, then strike at the place that mattered most while they were looking the other way. By the time the Dominion Armada moved on Helios, the nearest human battle group was 3 days away at maximum speed. At Earth Fleet Command, the situation was grim. Admiral Pete Dawson stood in the operations room and stared at the tactical display. 63 confirmed Dominion warships were converging on the Helios Corridor. His available forces were scattered across 4 sectors, responding to raids that he now understood had been designed to do exactly this. The 2nd Battle Group could reach Helios in 72 hours. The 7th Battle Group could arrive a few hours after that. But right now, at this moment, he had almost nothing in position to respond. Almost nothing was not the same as nothing. There was one ship within range. The USS Longbow, a Sentinel-class heavy frigate, was finishing a patrol run near the Helios region. It was not the largest ship in the fleet. It was not the newest. From the outside, it looked like any other mid-size warship, functional, compact, and unremarkable. But the Longbow carried something that no other ship in the fleet carried. It had been quietly selected, 8 months earlier, as the test platform for Project Aegis. Aegis was a weapon system that had been in development for 6 years. It was born out of a simple and uncomfortable truth. Humanity was outgunned. The Dominion had bigger ships, more ships, and better shields. In a straight fight, numbers against numbers, humanity would lose. So Earth's weapons engineers had asked a different question. What if one ship could hit hard enough to change the math? What if a single vessel could carry enough firepower to make a fleet think twice? The result was Aegis, a layered weapons suite that included kinetic lance projectors capable of punching through heavy shields, swarm missiles with adaptive warheads that could read and adjust to enemy shield frequencies in flight, and the centerpiece, a gravity pulse cannon that could warp local space around a target and crush it. All of it was hidden beneath panels of sensor-dampening armor that made the Longbow look like a standard frigate on any scan. The idea was simple. Look small, hit big. The problem was that Aegis had never been used in a real battle. Every test had been conducted against drones and targets in controlled environments. No one knew what would happen when the system faced a live enemy fleet. Admiral Dawson made the call. He opened a secure channel to the longbow and reached Captain Ben Archer. Archer was in his quarters when the orders came through. He was a tall man with a lined face and calm eyes that rarely showed what he was thinking. He had served in the fleet for 21 years and had commanded the longbow for the last 3. He was not the kind of officer who gave rousing speeches or chased glory. He was the kind who studied the problem, made a decision, and then carried it out without wasting words. His crew respected him not because he was inspiring, but because he was steady. In a crisis, steady mattered more. Dawson explained the situation in plain terms. 63 enemy ships. No reinforcements for 72 hours. Hold the corridor. Archer asked one question. And if the corridor falls before they get here? Then we lose the frontier colonies, Dawson replied, and the Dominion gets a straight road to the inner systems. There was a pause. Understood, Archer said. We'll hold it. He called his senior officers to the briefing room. Commander Lisa Monroe, his first officer, arrived first. She was a sharp woman with short dark hair and a habit of being 3 steps ahead of the conversation. When Archer laid out the situation, she studied the numbers on the display and said nothing for a long moment. Then she nodded once and began listing what they would need to prepare. Lieutenant Nora Bishop, the weapons systems officer, leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath when she heard the odds. Then she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that meant she had already started thinking about how to make the enemy pay for every kilometer of space. Ensign Danny Voss, the junior navigation officer, sat very still. This was his first deep space deployment. He had graduated from the academy less than a year ago. He had trained in simulators, studied battle histories, and scored well on every exam. None of that felt like enough right now. He looked at the number on the screen, 63, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. But he kept his mouth shut and his hands steady. Chief Engineer Sam Caldwell was the last to arrive. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with grease-stained hands and a deep voice. He had served on more ships than he could easily count, and he had kept all of them running long past the point where they should have fallen apart. When Archer told him what was coming, Caldwell scratched his jaw and said, "I'll need to bring the reactor up to full output. She'll complain, but she'll do it." Archer looked at each of them in turn. He did not give a speech. He did not try to make it sound better than it was. He simply said, "We jump in 40 minutes. Get your departments ready." The longbow turned toward the Helios corridor, powered up its hyperspace drive, and jumped. It arrived alone, at the mouth of the corridor, in the dark between the stars. The longbow dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Helios corridor, and the bridge went quiet. Danny Voss was the first to read the sensor data, and his voice came out flat and careful, the way a person speaks when they are trying very hard not to sound afraid. 63 contacts confirmed, crescent formation, flagship at center. The tactical display lit up with red markers. They spread across the screen in a wide, curving line, like the jaw of some enormous creature slowly opening. Each marker was a Valori warship, destroyers, cruisers, heavy frigates, and at the heart of the formation, the largest signal of all, the Throne of Silence, Grand Marshal Thyrak's personal flagship. It was a vessel nearly 4 times the size of the longbow, bristling with weapons and wrapped in layered shields that could absorb punishment that would crack a small moon. Lisa Monroe studied the formation from her station and spoke without looking up. "They arranged themselves for a show. That's a ceremonial deployment, not a combat one. They're not expecting a fight." "Good," Archer said from the captain's chair. He had not moved since they arrived. His hands rested on the armrests, and his eyes were fixed on the main viewer, where the Valori fleet glittered like a field of cold stars against the black. "Let them keep not expecting one." The comm panel chirped, Nora Bishop glanced at it and raised an eyebrow. Incoming broad-spectrum transmission. They're broadcasting on an open channel. Every ship in their fleet can hear it, and they want us to hear it too. Put it through, Archer said. The voice of Grand Marshal Thyrak filled the bridge. It was deep, smooth, and carried the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. The universal translator handled the words cleanly, and every syllable dripped with amusement. Attention, human vessel. I am Grand Marshal Thyrak of the Valori Dominion, commander of the 2nd Expeditionary Armada. You have entered a region that is now under Dominion authority. I must admit, I am surprised. We expected a fleet. We prepared for a battle group at minimum. Instead, we find one small ship, sitting alone in the dark like a lost child. A ripple of laughter came through the channel. Not from Thyrak, but from the crews of his other ships. The broadcast was open, and they were enjoying the show. Thyrak continued. I have studied your species with some interest. You are young, you are loud, and you have a curious habit of believing that courage is a substitute for capability. It is not. Courage without strength is simply a slower form of dying. He paused for effect. I am not a cruel commander. I offer you this chance. Turn your ship around, leave this corridor, return to your people, and tell them that the Dominion came, and that wisdom guided your retreat. There is no shame in recognizing when you are outmatched. There is only shame in pretending otherwise. More laughter from the fleet. Someone on one of the destroyers made a comment that the translator picked up. Something about humans and their ugly ships. On the Longbow's bridge, the crew listened in silence. Danny Voss gripped the edge of his console. Nora Bishop's smile had returned, that cold, patient smile that had nothing to do with happiness. Lisa Monroe kept her eyes on her tactical readouts, already running scenarios. Archer waited. He let the silence stretch. He let Thyrak wonder, for just a moment, whether anyone was even listening. Then he leaned forward slightly and opened the reply channel. His voice was calm, steady, and completely without drama. We're not leaving. 3 words, that was all he gave them. Then he closed the channel. On the throne of silence, Thyrak stared at the communication console as if it had insulted him. He had expected fear, or bluster, or perhaps a desperate attempt at negotiation. He had not expected 3 words and silence. It was, in a way he could not quite explain, deeply irritating. Sub-Commander Illis stood at the secondary command station, watching the sensor feeds with a focus that the rest of the bridge crew did not share. She was Thyrak's chief tactical advisor, a tall, angular figure with pale gray skin and sharp eyes that missed very little. While the rest of the fleet had been laughing, she had been studying the human ship, and something about the readings bothered her. Grand Marshal, she said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. The energy signature from that vessel is unusual. The output levels are inconsistent with a standard frigate of that class. I recommend a deep spectrum scan before we engage. Thyrak waved a hand dismissively. It is one ship, Illis. One small, outdated human ship. I do not need a deep spectrum scan to know what it is. I need it to move, or I need it to die. Those are the only 2 options. With respect, the readings suggest, I heard you, and I am telling you that it does not matter. Even if that ship carried twice the weapons of a standard frigate, it is still one ship against 63. The mathematics are not complicated. Illis pressed her lips together but said nothing more. She had served under Thyrak for 7 years. She knew when he would listen and when he would not. This was the second kind. Thyrak opened the fleet channel. Vanguard Group, advance and engage. Destroy the human vessel. Make it quick. We have a corridor to claim. 12 ships broke from the crescent formation and began moving toward the longbow. 4 destroyers, 6 cruisers, and 2 heavy escorts. They accelerated in a loose wedge, their weapons already glowing with charge. Against a single frigate, it was more than enough. It was, by any reasonable standard, overkill. On the longbow the crew watched them come. 12 ships inbound, Danny Voss reported. Formation suggests a standard assault pattern. Time to weapons range, 4 minutes. Archer nodded. Sam, how's the reactor? From deep in the ship, Sam Caldwell's voice came through the intercom, rough and steady. She's at full output, Captain. Running a little hot, but she's ready. Aegis has everything it needs. Nora, Archer said. Nora Bishop's hands moved across her console with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this sequence 100 times in her mind. Across the hull of the longbow, things began to change. Panels that had looked like ordinary armor plating retracted smoothly, sliding back to reveal what was hidden beneath. Rows of kinetic lance emitters extended into firing position. Swarm missile pods rotated and locked. Deep in the belly of the ship, the gravity pulse cannon hummed to life, its charging cycle sending a low vibration through the entire vessel that every crew member could feel in their bones. The longbow had been designed to look like something it was not. From the outside, for the entire time it had been sitting at the mouth of the corridor, it had appeared to be a standard Sentinel-class frigate, a capable ship, but nothing extraordinary. That disguise was now falling away. The ship that emerged from behind it was something else entirely. It was a weapon platform wrapped in the shell of a frigate, and it was waking up. Nora Bishop checked her targeting arrays one final time and looked at Archer. Aegis is hot. All systems green. Targets are painted. The 12 velarized ships were closing fast. On their bridges, crews prepared for what they expected to be a brief and one-sided engagement. Some of them were still smiling from the jokes they had made minutes earlier. Lisa Monroe glanced at Archer. They're in optimal range in 30 seconds. Danny Voss counted down quietly at his station. His hands had stopped shaking. There was no room for shaking now. There was only the math, the distance, and the moment. Archer watched the viewer. The Vanguard ships grew larger, their running lights bright against the dark corridor. He could see the glow of their weapons charging, the shimmer of their shields at full strength. They were confident. They were 12 against 1. They had every reason to believe this would be easy. He let them get close, closer than Lisa Monroe was comfortable with, closer than the tactical manuals recommended. He wanted them inside the range where every shot counted and where there would be no time to react. The distance counter hit the number he had been waiting for. Fire, he said. Nora Bishop pressed the command, and the longbows spoke with a voice that none of them had ever heard before. The first thing the Velari Vanguard saw was light. Not the soft glow of a standard weapons discharge, not the familiar pulse of plasma cannons or energy lances that they had trained against for years. This was something different. A white-hot streak tore through the space between the longbow and the lead destroyer, so fast that the sensors on the receiving ship barely had time to register it before it hit. The kinetic lance struck the destroyer's forward shields and did not stop. It punched through them as if they were paper, passed through the armored hull beneath, and exited out the other side in a spray of molten metal and frozen atmosphere. The destroyer buckled, its spine broken in a single blow. Internal explosions rippled along its length, and within seconds the ship went dark and began to drift. The crew of the second destroyer had just enough time to register what had happened to the first before the swarm missiles arrived. Nora Bishop had launched them in a staggered wave, 3 volleys of 8, each warhead carrying an adaptive payload that scanned the target's shield frequency during approach and adjusted itself to exploit the weakest point. The first volley hit the second destroyer's shields and cracked them open. The second volley passed through the gap and detonated against the hull. The third was unnecessary, but Bishop had sent it anyway, because she believed in being thorough. 2 destroyers gone in less than 20 seconds. The 6 cruisers in the Vanguard broke formation immediately. Their captains were trained officers, and they recognized in an instant that this was not the fight they had expected. They spread out, trying to create distance and angle, trying to force the longbow to divide its fire. It was a sound tactical response. Under normal circumstances, it would have worked. But the longbow was not fighting under normal circumstances. The gravity pulse cannon fired for the first time. It made no sound, there was no sound in space, but on the longbow's bridge, the crew felt it. A deep, resonant thrum that seemed to come from the walls and the floor and the air itself. The cannon sent a focused burst of gravitational energy toward two of the cruisers that had been trying to flank right. The pulse reached them, and did something that their crews had never experienced, and could not have prepared for. Local space around the two ships bent. It folded inward, pulling the two vessels toward each other with a force that their engines could not overcome. The cruisers collided, not gently, not slowly, but with the full momentum of two warships being dragged together by a force that did not care about their shields or their armor, or the desperate thrust of their engines trying to pull away. The impact crumpled both ships along their midsections. Atmosphere vented. Power systems failed. Neither ship exploded, but neither ship would ever fly again. 4 ships down. The engagement was barely a minute old. The remaining cruisers and the 2 heavy escorts tried to regroup. They pulled back to a tighter formation and concentrated their fire on the longbow. Energy beams and plasma bolts lashed across the distance, and some of them hit. The longbow's shields flared under the impacts, absorbing damage that would have crippled a lesser vessel. But the ship held. Nora Bishop answered every incoming volley with one of her own. She worked her console with a calm precision that seemed almost mechanical, but her eyes were alive with focus. Each target was selected, evaluated, and engaged in the time it took most officers to blink. The kinetic lances hammered the heavy escorts, punching holes in their shields and hull plating with each shot. The swarm missiles hunted the cruisers, chasing them through evasive maneuvers with a patience that was almost cruel. Another cruiser's reactor breached under sustained fire. It erupted in a flash of blue-white light that momentarily washed out every sensor in the area. Danny Voss kept his eyes on his navigation console and tracked the movement of every ship in the area, feeding updated positions and vectors to Bishop's targeting system. His voice was steady now, the nervousness from before buried under the weight of the moment. There was no room for fear when every second of delay could mean a missile that missed or a lance that struck too late. By the 90-second mark, 7 of the 12 Vanguard ships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 5, 2 cruisers and 3 smaller escorts that had hung back during the worst of it, turned and ran. They did not retreat in formation. They did not execute an orderly withdrawal. They fled, engines at maximum, back toward the safety of the main fleet. And then, for the first time since the battle began, the Velari comms went silent. On the bridge of the Throne of Silence, Grand Marshal Thyrak stood very still. The tactical display in front of him told a story that he did not want to believe. 7 ships destroyed in 90 seconds. 7 ships crewed by trained Velari officers, armed with Dominion weapons, shielded by Dominion technology, wiped away by a single human frigate as easily as a hand brushing dust from a table. The bridge crew around him was quiet. No one was laughing now. The officers at their stations exchanged glances that carried questions none of them wanted to ask out loud. Subcommander Illis replayed the sensor data at her station. She watched the kinetic lance impacts, studied the shield penetration patterns of the swarm missiles, and examined the gravitational anomaly caused by the pulse cannon. Her expression was not one of shock. It was one of grim confirmation. She had warned Thyrak. The energy readings had been unusual. The ship had been hiding something, and now that something had killed 7 warships in the time it took to drink a cup of water. "Grand Marshal," she said, and her voice carried a weight that made Thyrak turn. "That is not a standard frigate. Its weapons are beyond anything in our intelligence files on human technology. The kinetic lances alone are operating at a power level that should require a ship 3 times that size. And the gravitational weapon," she paused, choosing her words, "I have no reference for it. It is not in any known human arsenal. Thyrak's jaw tightened. He looked at the display, where the 5 surviving Vanguard ships were still retreating at full speed, and then at the longbow, which sat in the mouth of the corridor, exactly where it had been since the beginning. It had not chased the survivors. It was simply sitting there, waiting, as if it had all the time in the universe. "It is still one ship," Thyrak said, but the words did not carry the same easy confidence they had before. "One ship that just killed 7 of ours in 90 seconds, Illis replied. She did not raise her voice, but she did not look away either. "If we send the fleet in piecemeal, it will do the same thing again and again. The corridor is narrow. It favors the defender. That ship's captain knows it." Thyrak was silent for a long moment. Around him, his bridge officers waited. They had followed him through dozens of campaigns. They had watched him conquer systems and break fleets and bend entire civilizations to the Dominion's will. They had never seen him hesitate. He did not hesitate now, but something in his eyes had changed. The amusement was gone. In its place was something harder. Not fear, not yet, but the cold recognition that this would not be as simple as he had promised the High Command it would be. "All ships," he said, his voice carrying across the fleet channel. "Full advance, attack formation. Every vessel engages the target simultaneously. I want that ship destroyed." On the longbow, Danny Voss watched his sensor display light up with movement. Every remaining Velari warship was accelerating toward them. The crescent formation was collapsing inward, reshaping itself into a massive assault wedge aimed directly at the corridor entrance. 56 ships inbound, he said. 3 approach vectors. Estimated time to engagement range, 6 minutes. Sam Caldwell's voice came over the intercom from engineering. "Reactors holding, Captain. Running hot, but she'll manage. Gravity cannon needs 12 minutes to recharge." Lisa Monroe was already moving, pulling up damage control rosters and rerouting power from non-essential systems. "I'm putting repair teams on standby. This next part is going to hurt." Nora Bishop reloaded her missile systems and recalibrated the kinetic lances. Her smile was gone now, too. What was coming was not a vanguard. It was the entire fleet. And even with Aegis, the math was not kind. Archer looked at the wave of red markers sweeping toward them on the display. 56 warships, 6 minutes away. No reinforcements for nearly 70 more hours. He settled deeper into his chair and said, "Good. Now they're taking us seriously." The first full assault hit the longbow like a hammer. 56 ships firing at once, their combined energy output turning the space around the corridor entrance into a storm of light and heat. The longbow's shields absorbed the first wave, flared bright enough to blind external cameras, and then began to crack under the sustained bombardment. Archer did not try to stand and fight in place. He had known from the beginning that holding a fixed position against the entire fleet would get them killed in minutes. The longbow was powerful, but it was not invincible. What it needed was room to move, time to breathe between volleys, and terrain to use. The Helios corridor gave it all 3. The corridor was not an empty stretch of open space. It was a narrow band of stable hyperspace, roughly 40,000 kilometers wide and stretching for millions of kilometers in length. Along its edges, dense asteroid fields drifted in slow, grinding orbits. Pockets of energy storms, leftover radiation from the ancient stellar event that had created the corridor, flickered and crackled in unpredictable patterns. The passage was littered with debris, dead comets, and gravitational eddies that could pull a ship off course if the helmsman was not paying attention. For a large fleet, the corridor was a nightmare. Ships could not spread out. They could not flank effectively. They had to move in columns or loose clusters, which meant that only the front ships could fire without risking hitting their own vessels. The deeper the Velari pushed into the corridor, the more their numerical advantage was neutralized by the geography. Archer knew this. Lisa Monroe had mapped every asteroid cluster, every energy storm, and every navigational hazard in the corridor before they had even arrived. Danny Voss had memorized the map so thoroughly that he could navigate the ship through the worst of it with his eyes closed. And so the longbow did not stand and fight. It retreated into the corridor, drawing the Velari fleet after it like a matador stepping backward with the cape. The first 24 hours were a series of ambushes. Archer would position the longbow behind an asteroid cluster or inside the edge of an energy storm, wait for the leading Velari squadron to pass, and then strike from an angle they did not expect. Nora Bishop would cripple the lead ship with the gravity cannon, which warped space around the target and left it spinning and powerless, and then shred the following ships with kinetic lances and swarm missiles before they could reorganize. The Velari adapted. They began sending scouts ahead. They tightened their formations. They assigned dedicated sensor ships to sweep for the longbow's energy signature. But the longbow was built to hide. Its sensor-dampening armor, the same panels that had concealed the Aegis weapons, also masked its emissions when powered down. Archer would go dark, drifting behind a dead comet with minimal systems running, and wait until the enemy passed before lighting up and striking from behind. By the end of the first day, 8 more Velari ships had been destroyed and 3 more disabled. The fleet that had entered the corridor with 56 warships now had 45. The mood aboard the Velari ships had changed. The confidence of the first hours was gone. In its place was a tense, watchful anger. They had come to crush one ship, and instead they were being hunted by it. The Velari crews began calling the longbow a name over their internal comms. The translator rendered it roughly as the Thorn. It was not a name of respect. It was a name of frustration, the kind of word you used for something small and painful that you could not get rid of, no matter how hard you tried. But the longbow was paying a price. By hour 30, the ship had taken significant damage. A concentrated barrage from a Velari cruiser group had breached decks 7 through 9 on the port side. Emergency bulkheads had sealed the sections, but the hull was open to space in 3 places, and the repair teams could not reach 2 of them safely. Internal sensors showed temperature drops in adjacent compartments, and crew members in those areas were working in emergency suits. Sam Caldwell lost 2 of his engineering crew during hour 26. A coolant line for the secondary reactor had been ruptured by a near miss that shook the entire ship. The line was venting superheated plasma into an access corridor, and if it was not sealed, the reactor would overheat and shut down, taking half the ship's power with it. 2 engineers, a young man named Kyle Perry and a woman named Dana Marsh, went in to seal it manually. They got the line closed, but the plasma exposure was too severe. Caldwell carried Kyle Perry out himself. Dana Marsh did not make it to the medical bay. Caldwell sealed the engineering section, checked the reactor output, and went back to work. His face showed nothing. His hands were steady, but he did not speak to anyone for 3 hours after that. Danny Voss was injured during hour 34. A Velari torpedo had detonated close enough to the longbow's hull to send a shockwave through the bridge. His navigation console overloaded and blew apart, sending fragments of metal and hot glass across his station. A piece of shrapnel opened a cut across his forehead that bled freely and would not stop. A medical officer on the bridge applied a field bandage and told him to go to the infirmary. Voss shook his head, wiped the blood from his eyes, switched to a backup console, and kept working. He was 23 years old, and he had already seen more combat in 2 days than most officers saw in a career. Lisa Monroe took direct command of a damage control squad during hour 40 when a fire broke out near the forward munitions bay. If the fire reached the stored warheads, the explosion would tear the bow off the ship. Monroe led a team of 6 crew members into the burning section with portable suppressors and sealed the area manually, working in heat that blistered the paint off the walls. They got the fire out with 4 minutes to spare. Monroe emerged with burns on her hands and forearms, and immediately returned to the bridge. By hour 48, the longbow had destroyed or disabled 26 Velari warships, more than a third of the original fleet. It was an extraordinary number, the kind of kill count that would have seemed like fantasy in any tactical simulation. But the cost was mounting. The Aegis suite was degrading. The gravity pulse cannon, which had been the ship's most devastating weapon, could now fire only once every 20 minutes. Its power conduits were overheating, and Caldwell warned that pushing it harder might burn the system out entirely. Half the swarm missile launchers were empty, their magazines spent. The kinetic lances were still functional, but 2 of the 8 emitters had been damaged by enemy fire and could not be repaired without a shipyard. The ship itself was scarred and battered. The once smooth hull was pockmarked with impact craters, scorched by energy weapons, and torn open in places that the repair teams had patched with whatever they could find. One of the main engine clusters was operating at 60%. Life support, in several sections, was on backup power. The crew was exhausted, running on stimulants and willpower, rotating through short rest periods that were never long enough. On the throne of silence, Grand Marshal Thyrak studied the casualty reports and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, not quite, but a cold awareness that he was losing. Not the battle, perhaps, but the narrative. He had brought 63 ships to take a corridor defended by a single human frigate, and that frigate had cost him 26 vessels in 2 days. Even if he won, this was already a humiliation. Sub-Commander Illis stood beside him, and for once she did not say anything. She did not need to. The numbers spoke clearly enough. Thyrak made his decision. He would commit everything, every remaining ship, in a single coordinated push, overwhelming the longbow from multiple directions simultaneously. The corridor was narrow, but if he timed the assault correctly, he could pin the human ship against an asteroid field and deny it room to maneuver. No more chasing, no more ambushes. One final strike. He opened the fleet channel. All ships will advance at the next cycle. Full combat deployment. We end this now. On the longbow, the crew could see it forming on their sensors. The remaining Velari ships, 37 of them, were grouping up for a massed assault. Lisa Monroe ran the projections and said quietly to Archer, "If they pin us, we can't survive a full fleet volley, not in the shape we're in." Archer looked at the clock on the bridge wall. 52 hours had passed since they arrived. 20 more hours until reinforcements. He opened the ship-wide comm. His voice was tired but even. "This is the captain. We have 12 more hours to hold. I know you're tired. I know the ship is hurting. I know some of you have lost friends today. I'm not going to tell you this will be easy, because it won't be. But I'm telling you we hold for 12 more hours. That's all. 12 hours. He closed the channel and looked at Lisa Monroe. She looked back at him with steady eyes and said, 12 hours. Nora Bishop loaded her last full magazine of swarm missiles and said nothing. She did not need to. By hour 70, the longbow barely looked like a ship anymore. It looked like something that had been dragged through the heart of a dying star and somehow refused to stop moving. The outer hull was torn open in dozens of places, exposing internal decks to the cold vacuum of space. Entire sections had been sealed off and abandoned. Dark, airless pockets where the lights had died, and the only movement was the slow drift of debris. Scorch marks from energy weapons streaked across the remaining armor like black veins. One of the forward sensor arrays had been sheared clean off by a kinetic round, leaving a jagged stump of twisted metal. The port engine cluster was dead. The starboard cluster was running at half power. Coughing and stuttering, with every thrust correction, Danny Voss fed into the helm. Inside, the ship was no better. The corridors were dim, lit by emergency strips that cast everything in a pale amber glow. The air recyclers were struggling, and the atmosphere on the lower decks had taken on a thin, metallic taste that caught in the throat. Crew members moved through the passageways with the slow, careful steps of people who had not slept properly in 3 days. Their uniforms were stained with sweat, coolant, and in some cases blood. Medical bay was full. The overflow was being treated in the mess hall, where the tables had been pushed aside to make room for makeshift cots. 17 crew members were dead. Their names were listed on a console in the captain's ready room, and Archer had read every one of them. The Aegis suite was a shadow of what it had been. The gravity pulse cannon was offline permanently. Caldwell had tried everything to coax it back to life, but the power conduits had finally burned through, and there were no replacement parts on board. The swarm missile launchers were empty. Every warhead spent across 3 days of running battles. Of the 8 kinetic lance emitters, only 3 still functioned. The rest were either destroyed by enemy fire or had overloaded from sustained use. What the longbow had left was stubbornness, a half-working reactor, 3 kinetic lances, a handful of conventional point defense turrets, and a crew that had simply decided they were not going to die today. Thyrax's fleet, still 30 ships strong after absorbing losses that would have broken most commanders, had regrouped at the far end of the corridor. They had spent the last few hours reorganizing, redistributing power, and preparing for a final coordinated push. Thyrax knew the human ship was crippled. His sensors showed the reduced power output, the offline weapon systems, the structural damage that should have torn the vessel apart hours ago. The longbow was held together by emergency welds, backup systems, and whatever engineering miracles Sam Caldwell was performing in the reactor room. This was the kill. Thyrax could feel it. One more push and the thorn would finally be pulled free. On the longbow's bridge, Archer made his decision. He turned to Danny Voss and said, "Take us to the Narrows." Voss looked at him. The Narrows was the tightest point in the entire Helios corridor, a stretch where asteroid fields on both sides squeezed the passable space down to less than 8,000 kilometers across. A ship positioned there would physically block the passage. Nothing larger than a shuttle could get past without going through it. "You want to park us in the gap," Voss said. It was not a question. "I want to park us in the gap," Archer confirmed. Voss nodded and brought the longbow around. The ship groaned as it turned, its damaged frame protesting every movement. But it moved. It limped forward on its one functioning engine cluster, trailing sparks and venting atmosphere from a dozen wounds, and it settled itself into the narrowest point of the corridor, like a cork in a bottle. Lisa Monroe looked at the position on the tactical display and understood immediately. The Velari could not pass without destroying the longbow first. And destroying the longbow, even in its current state, would cost them time and ships they could not afford if reinforcements were close. "We're the door," she said quietly. "We're the door," Archer agreed. Thyrax's fleet advanced, 30 warships in tight formation, filling the corridor from edge to edge, their weapons charged and their crews ready for the final engagement. They came on like a tide, and the longbows sat in their path and did not move. The Velari opened fire. The combined barrage of 30 ships lit up the corridor like a second sun. Energy beams, plasma bolts, and torpedoes rained down on the longbow in a continuous stream that overwhelmed what remained of its shields in the first volley. The shields collapsed, and the weapons struck the hull directly. The ship shuddered. Metal screamed, bulkheads buckled inward. A section of the upper deck peeled away and tumbled into space. And the longbow fired back. Nora Bishop worked her 3 remaining kinetic lances with the focus of a surgeon. She could not fight 30 ships. She knew that. But she could make every shot count. And she did. The first lance punched through the bow of a Velari cruiser and hit its weapons magazine. The cruiser exploded from the inside out, a bloom of fire that forced the ships behind it to break formation to avoid the debris. The second lance crippled a destroyer's engine, leaving it spinning helplessly in the path of its allies. The third struck the bridge of another cruiser, killing its command crew instantly and leaving the ship drifting and dark. 3 more kills. Even now, even broken and burning, the longbow was still dangerous. But the return fire was relentless. Another torpedo struck the engineering section, and the lights on the bridge flickered and died for 3 terrible seconds before the emergency power kicked in. Caldwell's voice came over the intercom, strained but controlled. "Reactor is holding. Barely. If they hit us there again, I make no promises." Archer gripped the armrest of his chair as another impact rocked the ship. A support beam above the bridge cracked and sagged downward. Sparks rained from a shattered conduit. Somewhere below them, an alarm was wailing, one of many that the crew had stopped paying attention to hours ago. Danny Voss stared at his sensor console. Through the static and interference of the bombardment, something was flickering at the edge of his detection range. New contacts. Dozens of them. He ran the scan again, adjusted for interference, and felt his heart lurch. "Captain," he said, and his voice cracked for the first time in 3 days. "Hyperspace signatures. Multiple contacts, bearing 170. They're coming in behind us." For one awful second, the bridge crew thought it was more Velari, that the Dominion had sent a second fleet, that the corridor was lost, and all of this had been for nothing. Then the identification codes came through, and Danny Voss let out a breath that seemed to empty his entire body. "It's the second battle group, and the 7th. 42 ships, Captain. They're here." The hyperspace exit points bloomed with light as ship after ship dropped into normal space behind the longbow. Heavy cruisers, battleships, carriers, destroyers, the full strength of 2 United Fleet battle groups, fresh and armed and ready. They fanned out across the corridor in a combat spread that was as beautiful as anything Archer had ever seen. Admiral Dawson's voice came over the comm, clear and calm. "Longbow, cavalry's here. You can breathe now." Archer closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, he said, "Understood, Admiral. We're still in the fight." "The hell you are," Dawson replied, and there was something in his voice that might have been emotion, tightly controlled. "You've done enough, Ben. Stand down, and let us take it from here." The fresh fleet surged forward, passing the battered longbow on both sides. Their weapons were hot, their shields at full strength, and they poured into the corridor with the fury of an army that had spent 3 days knowing their people were fighting alone. The Velari fleet, already weakened by 3 days of losses, now faced 42 warships in a corridor they had failed to take. The mathematics that Thyrak had once considered so simple were now working against him. His 30 remaining ships were tired, damaged, and funneled into a narrow space with a fresh enemy bearing down on them. The formation broke. It did not break all at once. Some captains held their positions longer than others. Some tried to fight, some tried to find a way past the human fleet. But one by one, ship by ship, they turned. The retreat began at the edges and spread inward like cracks in ice, until even the most loyal of Thyrak's captains accepted what Illis had been telling them for 2 days. This corridor was not theirs to take. On the throne of silence, Thyrak stood at the viewport and watched his fleet withdraw. Below him, still visible in the corridor, the longbow hung in the darkness. It was broken, burning, venting atmosphere from wounds that should have killed it 10 times over. Pieces of its hull drifted around it like leaves fallen from a dying tree. But it was still there. It had not moved. It had not retreated. For 71 hours and 40 minutes, one ship had stood in the way of his entire armada, and it had not moved. Subcommander Illis stepped forward and asked if he wanted to issue the formal withdrawal order. Thyrak said nothing for a long time. Then he turned from the viewport and walked to his command chair. "Record the engagement log," he said quietly. "All details, hold nothing back." Illis recorded a single line in the official log that would later spread across every species in the Dominion, passed from ship to ship and world to world, until it became something larger than a sentence. A warning, a lesson, and a grudging acknowledgement of something the Velari had never expected to feel toward humans. One ship held the gate for 3 days. We brought 63, and it was not enough. The longbow was towed home by a fleet tender. It could not fly under its own power anymore. The reactor, which Caldwell had kept alive through 3 days of combat through methods that the engineering manual would not have approved of, was finally allowed to rest. The crew stood down from battle stations for the first time in 72 hours and moved through the ship like sleepwalkers, too tired to celebrate, too alive to grieve properly for the 17 who were not with them anymore. Captain Ben Archer stood on the observation deck as the tender brought them into Earth orbit. The planet filled the viewport, blue and white and impossibly beautiful after 3 days of fire and darkness and the endless black of the corridor. He stood there alone, his uniform torn, his face gray with exhaustion, and he allowed himself a single, quiet breath. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been given an impossible job and had done it, and who was very, very tired. In the months that followed, the Veloride Dominion did not advance toward human space again. The border skirmishes stopped. The raiding parties were recalled. Diplomatic channels that had been silent for years quietly reopened. Something had shifted in the way the galaxy looked at humanity, not because of the fleet that arrived at the end, but because of what had happened before it got there. Across 100 worlds and 1,000 species, the story spread. The details changed in the telling, as stories always do. Some versions made the longbow larger, or gave it a crew of thousands, or added weapons that did not exist. But the core of the story stayed the same, because the core was the part that mattered. One ship, one crew, 72 hours, and they did not leave. That was the part that made the galaxy pay attention, not the firepower, not the technology, not the tactics, the simple, stubborn, unreasonable fact that when the humans were told the odds were impossible, they said, "We're not leaving," and meant it. It was, the other species agreed, a very human thing to do.